Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for the course entitled History and Systems of Energy. ये नफ्सियात की तारीख़ के बारे में कोर्स है. जैसे मैंने पहले आपसे गुजारिश की थी, ये नहायत बुनियादी कोर्स है और अगर इसको आप अच्छे से अज़बर कर लेंगे, if you get a good grasp of this subject, then the rest of the subjects would follow automatically. Because in this course, we will touch upon practically all the aspects of psychology. तो इसलिए आपके लिए मुनासिब है कि आप इस कोर्स को ध्यान से पढ़ें और सबसे अहम बात यह है कि आप साथ साथ इसका मुताला करते जाएं. अगर आप मुताले को डिले करेंगे, if you think that you need not study it now and that you might study it later, you might tend to forget certain things and you might tend to forget certain connections. And that would create problems for you. So my suggestion to you is that you should continue to study the course as you progress. चलिए इस एडवाइस नसीहत के बाद आगे थोड़ा चलते हैं और देखते हैं कि अभी तक हमने लेक्चर नंबर 5 में क्या देखा था. आपको याद होगा लेक्चर नंबर 5 जो है वो दो बहुत ही अजीम फिलोसॉफिकल साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स या फिलोसफर साइकोलॉजिस्ट से मुतल्लिक था. याद कीजिए कौन थे वो दोनों. सही है, पहला बड़ा नाम जो इस सिलसिले में हमने लिया था वो था अल-गज़ाली, जिन्हें हम इमाम गज़ाली भी कहते हैं. चलिए उनकी कुछ कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस पे नज़र-ए-सानी करते हैं. आपको याद होगा, जाहिर है कि इमाम गज़ाली की अल-गज़ाली की कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन तो बहुत ज़्यादा है. हम सब का अहाता तो नहीं कर सकते, लेकिन चीदा अहम चीज़ें जो जिनका नफ्सियात से और ख़ास तौर पे 21st सेंचुरी की नफ्सियात से गहरा ताल्लुक़ है, उनका दोबारा अयादा करते हैं, उन्हीं को रिपीट कर लेते हैं. इस सिलसिले में पहला कॉन्सेप्ट दैट यू नीड टू लुक एट इज़ दैट हिज डेफिनेशंस एंड हिज एक्सप्लेनेशंस of two kinds of self. One which he called nafs-e ammara, the inferior self. You could also consider it a self that Jung had called the shadow. You could also consider it like the part of the self that Freud talks about and calls it id. But then we will be talking about these two psychologists later, that is Jung and Freud. For the time being, the inferior self, the bad self, the not so good self is nafs-e ammara. All of us have that self, and all of us need to control, direct, and take hold of that part of the self. That was one of the concepts that Ghazali dealt with in detail, that is in particular reference to psychology and particularly modern psychology. दूसरा कॉन्सेप्ट जो इसी से मुतल्लिक था वो था उनका कॉन्सेप्ट which he called nafs-e mutmainna, the satisfied self, the superior self, the better self, the exalted self, जो बुलंद है, जिसमें लालच नहीं है, जिसमें गुनाह का तसव्वुर नहीं, कम है या नहीं है, जिसमें जो उन्होंने बहुत से वर्चूज़ बताए थे वो ज़्यादा हैं और जो वाइसेस बताई थी वो कम हैं या ना होने के बराबर हैं. तो ये दूसरी चीज़ है गज़ाली के सेल्फ कॉन्सेप्ट में. सो वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट two selves that Ghazali talked about, dwelt upon, explained, which have a particular reference to modern day psychology. Nafs-e Amara and Nafs-e Mutmainna. The other thing that Ghazali talked about was that there are two types of virtue. याद होगा आपको कि अजीब सी आपको शायद बात लगी होगी, आपको हैरानी हुई होगी कि there is a positive virtue that he enumerated, that he talked about, and there's a negative virtue that he talked about. Now, how can virtue be negative? Well, it doesn't have to be a vice. वो गुनाह नहीं है. और पॉजिटिव वर्च्यू जैसे अल्लाह ताला का तशक्कुर, मुतशक्कर होना, अल्लाह ताला का शुक्रिया अदा करना, उसकी बारगाह में सजूद होना, दूसरों के काम आना, दूसरों को आगे बढ़ने में उनके मुआविन व मददगार साबित होना, दूसरों पे जुल्म ना करना, जैसे ये सब के सब पॉजिटिव वर्च्यूज़ हैं. इसी तरह अल-गज़ाली ने कुछ नेगेटिव वर्च्यूज़ भी बताए हैं. और वो नेगेटिव वर्च्यूज़ क्या हैं? गुनाह से, सिन से इज्तनाब. अवॉइडिंग सिनफुल एक्ट्स is a negative virtue. If somebody feels like gambling, that is a sin, and he doesn't indulge in it, that is a kind of a negative virtue. If somebody feels like उसका दिल ललचाता है रिश्वत लेने पे, but he doesn't take it, he avoids a vice, he avoids committing a sin, that is an example of negative virtue. तो ग़ज़ाली ने हमें दो किस्म के वर्च्यूज का बताया था, पॉजिटिव एंड नेगेटिव वर्च्यूज. ये एक और उनका अहम कॉन्सेप्ट है जिसका मौजूदा 20th एंड 21st सेंचुरी पे बहुत गहरा असर है. ये हम आपको बताएंगे कैसे. थोड़ा और आगे देख लें कि इमाम ग़ज़ाली क्या कहते थे, क्या उन्होंने कहा नफ्सियात से मुतल्लिक. उन्होंने हमें कुछ ऐसे रास्ते भी बताए हैं जिन पर चल के you could change from being an inferior to being a superior person. He enumerates ways and means of controlling nafs-e ammara or turning nafs-e ammara into nafs-e mutmainna. ये मैं समझता हूँ, मेरा ज़ाती ख्याल है कि इमाम ग़ज़ाली अल-ग़ज़ाली की ये बहुत बड़ी कंट्रीब्यूशन है, that he recognized the ways in which the bad things, the harmful things, the vicious things that we have in ourselves can be controlled, can be redirected, can be gotten rid of, and then man can experience satisfaction, man can experience happiness, man can experience bliss. अगर आप गौर करें तो मौजूदा माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं, particularly those psychologists who are into practical treatment of mental disorders, are people who are training others, their patients, to turn their nafs-e ammara into the nafs-e mutmainna, changing the bad into the good, the painful self into a satisfied self. यही मॉडर्न क्लिनिकल साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स अपनी साइकोथेरेपी में उनकी कोशिश है. और इसके रास्ते हमें अल-गज़ाली ने बताए हैं. There are 6 ways that he suggested. Number 1, putting oneself straight, not giving into vices, not giving into greed, guarding the self, looking over and above the self. It is as if you have a better self and that looks down upon the inferior self and then does not let the inferior self go out of the acceptable parameters. That is the second way, guarding the self. The third way of improving the self, as suggested by Imam Ghazali, is self-criticism, criticizing the self. मुझ में क्या क्या गलतियां हैं, मैंने क्या क्या गलतियां की हैं. हर शख्स जो है कोई भी शख्स ले लीजिए, वो मौजूदा जिंदगी में कोई भी शख्स ले लें आप, वो इंसान गलतियों का पुतला है. एंड हाउ डज गजाली सजेस्ट दैट ही कैन correct himself? By criticizing himself. That is the third way that he talks about. Self-criticism. Fourth, punishing yourself. If you inadvertently, बगैर ख्वाहिश किए, अगर आपसे कोई गलती हो जाती है, then how to atone for it? उसका अजाला कैसे किया जाए? And that is punishing the self. You could punish yourself by a number of ways. Denying, for instance, what you want to do is a kind of a self-punishment. Not doing what you would like to do is a kind of a self-punishment. And that is what Ghazali is talking about, that the fourth way of getting at nafs-e ammara is self-punishment. And then, of course, the fifth one is expressing the self. And expressing the self doesn't only involve usage of words or usage of language. You express yourself by behavior. You express yourself by not acting. अजीब सी बात मालूम हो रही ना आपको कि आप अपनी ज़ात का इजहार कुछ किए बगैर भी कर सकते हैं. मिसाल के तौर पर, अगर आप देखें कि आपके उस्ताद मुहतरम क्लास में आए हैं और आप कुछ ना करें, आप बैठे रहें, तो ये भी एक एक्सप्रेशन है, विच इज़ नॉट ए गुड एक्सप्रेशन ऑफ द सेल्फ. अगर आप खड़े हों, सलाम करें, उनके हाल अहवाल पूछें, तो ये भी सेल्फ का एक्सप्रेशन है, और ये अच्छा एक्सप्रेशन है. किसी से बोलना, बात करना एक्सप्रेशन है, लेकिन बॉडी लैंग्वेज इज ऑल्सो expression. But not doing things is also expression. Not performing what is the right thing to do is an expression. So, choosing the right expression, choosing the virtuous expression is the way that Al-Ghazali suggests as a way to achieve from the lower self to a higher self. And finally, the sixth one is what he calls cleansing the self. अपनी ज़ात को मुसफ़ा रखना, साफ करना. हर वक्त हमारे जहन में बैरूनी मुहज्जात की वजह से, because of external stimuli, because of internal stimuli, all kinds of ideas come into our mind. The ideas are not all good. Some of those ideas may be bad. So if we could possibly get rid of those ideas and dwell upon the good ideas to the exclusion of bad ideas, that is what is the sixth and the final way that Imam Ghazali suggests of cleansing the self. Rising above nafs-e ammara into nafs-e mutmainna. These six practices are the ways that have been suggested by Al-Ghazali how man could achieve a higher position in life. तो इमाम गजाली की ये 3-4 अहम कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस हैं. इनमें हमने थोड़ा थोड़ा रद्दो बदल किया है, हमसे मेरी मुराद लेटर साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स ने, बट वी विल टॉक अबाउट देम व्हेन द टाइम कम्स. फॉर द टाइम बीइंग, it is enough for you to know that these giants had contributed to understanding of man and how the inferior could be turned into a superior being. दूसरे अहम जो कंट्रीब्यूटर थे जिनका पिछली मरतबे हमने जिक्र किया था, वो हैं एवरोस, जिन्हें हम फारसी में या उर्दू में इब्न रुश्द भी कहते हैं. ये एवरोस differed radically from the old view of the soul. Remember, the ancients of the subcontinent and the ancient Greeks and up to much later soul had been regarded as immaterial, made of not material things, but ethereal things. And soul was regarded as immortal. But Averroes is the person who says that soul is material and it is mortal. Well, if soul is material and it's mortal, how does it express itself? Remember, the ancient subcontinental philosophers, psychologists, some of them had regarded soul to be at least partially material. And one expression of that material soul was blood. Soul was understood to be existing in one's blood. अभी भी ये किसी हद तक ख्याल जो है 21वीं सदी में भी किसी हद तक कुछ लोगों में राइज है. मिसाल के तौर पर later in the 17th and 16th and 18th century, when people were possessed by mental illness, those people thought that man was possessed by the devil, that his or her soul had been taken over by the evil, and that if bloodletting was done on the body, अगर खून जिस्म से खारिज कर दिया जाए तो फिर सोल का या जहनी मरीज का या जहनी अमराज का इलाज हो सकता है. ये 17वीं, 18वीं, 19वीं सदी तक यूरोप में ये लोगों के ख्यालात रहे थे. सो पार्ट ऑफ द सोल वॉज मटीरियल. बाय द वे, दिस इज ऑल्सो इन सम ऑफ द parts of the world. In our country, for instance, some people still regard blood as part of one's soul and bloodletting, खून बहाना, as one of the cures of mental diseases. तो इसलिए ये कोई इतनी हैरानी की बात नहीं है when Averroes says that soul was material and mortal. इतनी कोई हैरानी की बात नहीं है. We are still under a part of thinking still holds this view to be true. That was one contribution of Averroes. The other was, he was a follower of the Aristotelian tradition. Now, what is Aristotelian tradition? Remember Aristotle, अरस्तु आपको याद है? अरस्तु ने कहा था कि knowledge जो है वो सिर्फ observation से हो सकती है. That knowledge can be gathered by the senses and observation. Now, Averroes followed the Aristotelian tradition, and he also put forward the view that knowledge is gathered by observation. My 5 senses, that is, my eyes, my nose, ear, tongue, and my sense of touch. These are the sense organs that provide me knowledge. And this is what Averroes is saying. First, that soul is material. 2, that knowledge can be gathered by the sense organs. And the third thing that he talked about was that all events, everything that we observe, all that exists in the world is caused. There is a cause behind everything that we see. And denial of the cause is denial of knowledge. That if you do not see that connection between the cause and the effect, then you are denying yourself knowledge. This is a very, very important contribution. That everything is caused. मैंने पिछली दफ़े आपसे गुजारिश की थी कि आप शायद महसूस करते होंगे that accidents are not caused. Accidents are accidents. Things happen. No, accidents are not accidents in the sense that they are also caused. We may not know about the cause. We may not know the entire spectrum of causes that cause accident, but accidents are caused. For instance, take a look at an accident when somebody drives a car into a tree. Well, is there a cause? Of course there is a cause. He might be under the influence of a drug. He might be sick. The car's wheels are spinning. The car's engine is running. The steering wheel is directing it in a certain direction. So all of these are causes. So even when a car strikes a tree and you consider that an accident, that is really caused. So you, in order to understand and gain knowledge and gather knowledge, must find causes, because all events, all that we see have causes, and these causes are related to effects. And that is a modern way of thinking. That is the scientist's way of thinking. And that is one of the great contributions of this person that is held in such great esteem by historians of psychology, Averroes. ये तो हमने रिव्यू किया, और अब चलते हैं थोड़ा सा और आगे और देखते हैं कि यूरोप में क्या हो रहा था. रेनेसेंस और रेनेसां, it's a French word which literally means rebirth. आपको याद है कि इस ज़माने से कुछ पहले, we are talking now of the late 12th, the early 13th century to the 16th century. ज़रा बताइए 13th century कौन सी होगी? 1344 13th century होगी? जी नहीं, वो 1400 सेंचुरी है, क्योंकि जब मैं वो कहता हूँ 1344, तो 13 सदियां पूरी हो चुकी हैं और 14वीं सदी के 44 साल भी गुजर चुके हैं. इसलिए प्लीज इसके बारे में कंफ्यूज ना हो. 13th century means 1200 and something, and 16th century means, बताइए. जी हाँ, 1500 and something, 1501, 1502, 1568, all of these years are 16th century. इससे पहले का जो पीरियड है, जिसके पिछले दफे हम जिक्र कर रहे थे, वो पीरियड यूरोप में कहलाता था डार्क एजेस, क्योंकि उस वक्त आपको याद है कि रिसर्च और न्यू आइडियाज को डिस्करेज किया जाता था. लेकिन जो ही ये रीबर्थ या रेनेसांस का बोलबाला हुआ, जिसको हम फ्रेंच में रीबर्थ कहते हैं, तो इस एज के दौरान बहुत अहम लोग पैदा हुए और उनकी बहुत अहम थियोरीज और उनके एक्सपेरिमेंट्स और उनकी इजादात इंसानों तक पहुंची. कुछ अहम नाम इसके हैं फ्रांसिस बेकन. एक और अहम नाम है न्यूटन. आपने न्यूटन का नाम सुना होगा. बताइए किस रेफरेंस में सुना है? जी हाँ, कैम्ब्रिज यूनिवर्सिटी में. बताइए, कैम्ब्रिज यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाते थे. फिजिसिस्ट की हैसियत से उनको जानते हैं, जिन्होंने दरख्त से फल गिरते हुए, सेब गिरते हुए अपनी थियरीज का एक सिलसिला शुरू किया था. उन्होंने देखा कि सेब जो है वो दरख्त से नीचे गिरा, एंड ही thought, why did the apple fall to the ground? Why did it not remain suspended in air? Why didn't it go to the left or to the right, or why didn't it rise? And from there he postulated his theories, which are today known as Newtonian theories. He was one of the most important contributors of this period that we are talking about. Another important contributor in this time is Galileo. Galileo was, as you know, an Italian. And you remember he went up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he dropped a few things from there to show that the movement of the bodies towards the earth take place in a certain proportion, in a certain manner. तो ये लिटरेचर या फिलॉसफी में फ्रांसिस बेकन है, और फिज़िक्स में न्यूटन है, और एस्ट्रोनॉमी या फिज़िक्स में गैलीलियो हैं. ये इसी एज से मुतल्लिक हैं सब लोग. और भी बहुत से नाम हैं, लेकिन एक अहम नाम जो हम नफ्सियात में जिसको हम बहुत अहम समझते हैं, वो है रेनी डिकार्टे. RENEDESTARTEC, जैसा कि आप स्लाइड पे भी देख रहे होंगे. रेनी डिकार्टे, written as Descartes, pronounced as Descartes. He was born in 1596 and he died in 1650. ये कौन सी सदी बनती है? 1560, 1550 would be, जी हाँ, 16th century and 17th century. तो अब हम उस डार्क पीरियड से निकल आए हैं और अब हम इस ल्यूमिनस पीरियड में आ गए हैं. चलिए इनकी कंट्रीब्यूशन देखते हैं. रेने डिकार्टे की क्या कंट्रीब्यूशन है? पहली बात तो ये दैट ही वाज ए शाइनिंग स्टार ऑफ द टाइम्स. ही वाज ए सोल्जर, ही वाज ए साइंटिस्ट, ही वाज ए मैथमेटिशियन, ही वाज ए फिलोसोफर, साइकोलॉजिस्ट, एंड ही वाज ए ग्रेट टीचर. ये एक इंसान में बहुत सी खुसूसियात इकट्ठी थी, एंड दैट इज वन ऑफ द मेन रीजंस फॉर हिज ग्रेटनेस. थोड़ा सा इससे आगे चलें कि उन्होंने क्या कंट्रीब्यूशन किया. हिज मेन मेथड ऑफ एक्वायरिंग नॉलेज वाज व्हाट ही कॉल्ड स्केप्टिसिज्म, डाउट, स्केप्टिसिज्म. ही डाउटेड एवरीथिंग. चलिए थोड़ा सा पीछे इनको कंपेयर करते हैं रेने डिकार्टे को इमाम गजाली के साथ. आपको याद है इमाम गजाली या अल गजाली ने मजहब और फलसफा दोनों का मुतालिया किया था, और मजहब और फलसफे के मुताले की वजह से आपको याद होगा, हमने पिछले लेक्चर में आपको बताया था दैट इमाम गजाली और अल गजाली had become so engrossed in it that it started affecting his health, that he became physically sick because of some conflicts that he saw between the two lines that he was pursuing, the line of religious thinking and the line of philosophical thinking, and that led him to become physically sick. So he, in order to avoid that, he stopped doubting. Now, the method of Descartes is opposite to what Al-Ghazali had done. Descartes pursued his doubt. He said, okay, if I'm doubtful, then I will pursue my doubt to its logical conclusion. A very brave man, it takes a very brave man to do that. हमारे दिल में किसी भी बारे में शक आए तो हम उस शक को निकाल देते हैं, उस शक पे पर्दापोशी करते हैं. This is not what René Descartes did. He followed his doubt, he followed his skepticism. And where did he achieve? What did he achieve by continuing to doubt? He thought that senses could deceive. ऐसा ही है. Senses could deceive. Although this is against the Aristotelian tradition, you remember? Aristotle had told us that knowledge can be gathered only through the sense organs. But last time we also saw that sometimes sense organs can be deceptive. They can deceive us. Remember, I gave you the example of an illusion. Let me repeat that example for you. You are walking in the lawn. आप बाग में सैर कर रहे हैं, and the light is not very good. It's late evening, and you see a twig in where you are walking around, and you confuse that twig, chhadi, to be a snake. Here is what your senses have done. Your senses have deceived you. You have considered, you have thought, your senses have led you to think that the twig is a snake. So senses can deceive sometimes, and that is what Descartes said, that senses can deceive. Sense organs can lead you astray. Okay? Then what can lead you in the right path? Doubt. All right? Let us continue to doubt. I can doubt everything. This table is not here. My laptop is not here. You can say, you can go out in the streets and say, the senses are deceiving you. Those cars and those people are not there. You can say that people around you are part of an illusion. All of these can be denied, except one thing, which cannot be denied. And what is that that cannot be denied? That is the doubt itself. You cannot deny that you are doubting. That is a fact. Your thinking is a fact. Your doubt is a fact. And that is the conclusion that Descartes arrived at, that doubt or thinking is a fact. And he expressed it in a most satisfying way. And what is it? Cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum. जैसा कि आप देख रहे होंगे अपनी स्क्रीन पर, COGITO ergo ERGO sum, SUM. Cogito means I think. Ergo means therefore. Sum means I exist. I exist because I think. Or my existence can be proved by my thinking. You cannot say that I do not exist. You cannot doubt this. You can doubt everything else, but you cannot doubt the doubt itself. That there is some force, there is something, somebody who's doubting. And that is the end of skepticism. That is the solid basis of thinking. Your doubt ends there. You can build a whole argument on this. So that is one of the main contributions of Descartes. That is, cogito ergo sum. Continue to doubt. Take your doubt to its logical conclusion, and then that doubt will lead you to a solid basis, as in his case. Cogito ergo sum. दूसरी बात जो अभी तक डेकार्टे ने हमें बताई है और जिसके बारे में हम उसको एक अजीम माहिर नफ्सियात समझ सकते हैं, वो जैसे मैंने आपको पहले भी बताया था कि उस वक्त नफ्सियात एक एक्सपेरिमेंटल साइंस नहीं थी. उस वक्त साइकोलॉजिकल लेबॉरेटरीज नहीं बनी थी. उस वक्त हमारे इस तरह के तजुर्बात नहीं थे, उनको तजुर्बात की रोशनी उनको अवेलेबल नहीं थी. इसलिए उनके ख्यालात जो हैं वो आज के ज़माने से कंपेयर करते हुए हमें थोड़े से स्पेकुलेटिव, मफरूज़े पे बेस्ड दिखाई देंगे. चलिए देखते हैं वो क्या ख्याल था. वो ख्याल था दैट द सोल एंड द बॉडी आर टू डिफरेंट थिंग्स. दैट यू हैव वन एंटिटी which is the soul, and you have another entity which is the body. Now soul is higher than the body, and body is lower than the soul. Soul determines, and body acts, follows. Soul operates under its own laws, and body operates under its own laws. Soul's laws are superior body's laws are inferior. Body's laws are, the body behaves like a machine. We can't say the same thing Descartes thought about the soul. The soul doesn't behave like a machine. The body behaves like a machine. But as we know operative laws of machines, as we can discover the operative laws of machines, वो असूल जिनके तहत कोई मशीन फंक्शन करती है, उनके बारे में हम आगाही हासिल कर सकते हैं. इसी तरह से हम बॉडीज के लॉ के बारे में भी आगाही हासिल कर सकते हैं. लेकिन, और ये अहम बात है, बॉडी जो है, जिस्म जो है, वो सोल से अलहदा है. एंड दिस इज द अदर कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ डिकार्टे, दैट इज ड्यूलिज्म, considering soul and body to be two different entities, interacting but two different entities. Soul with its own operative laws and body with its own operative laws. Let us go back a little and let me refresh your mind on what Avicenna had said. Do you remember what Avicenna had said about soul and body? जी हाँ, आपको याद होगा कि एविसीना ने, जिनको हम बुओली सीना भी कहते हैं, हमें बताया था कि हमारी जो रूह है उसका हमारे जिस्म पे बहुत गहरा असर पड़ता है और हमारी रूह जो है वो हमारे जिस्म को बीमार भी कर देती है. याद है आपको? उन्होंने ये भी बताया था कि हमारी बीमारी जो है, चाहे वो नफ्सियाती बीमारी हो या जिस्मानी बीमारी हो, whether we are talking about aches and pains, whether we are talking about headache or a tummy ache, or we are talking about anxiety or depression, which are psychological diseases, in any of these two categories of diseases, Avicenna had said, soul is involved. Soul impacts the body. He had gone even further than that and had said that if the soul of a person is strong, remember, if there is power and strength in the soul of a person, or if his soul could be empowered, could be strengthened, then soul could be a source of health for the person. याद आया आपको? एविसीना ने हमें ये कनेक्शन बताया हुआ है, that the soul and the body interact. And this is, by the way, prior to Descartes. We are talking about, Avicenna was born 980. That is, we are talking about 10th century. And Descartes is much later. So, you must see this connection. That it is not a thought that Descartes comes up from the blue. It is a thought that had been current in the psychological, medical, and philosophical literature, that soul affects the body and that body affects the soul. Let us get back to Descartes now. He is called a dualist. A dualist means, भाई जरा स्पेलिंग देख लीजिए, DUALIST. और इसलिए मैंने आपकी तवज्जो इस तरफ कराई है क्योंकि ये ड्यूअल नहीं है, DUEL नहीं है, जिसका मतलब होता है मुकाबला. ये ड्यूअल का, इस ड्यूअल का मतलब है तोहरा. René Descartes is known as the dualist, not because he used to fight or enter into duels, but because he separated the soul from the body And he told us that soul has its own operative principles and the body has its own operative principles. And how is the soul connected to the body? That is another contribution of Descartes. And how is it connected? It is connected by a gland that he called the pineal gland, as you would see on your screen. The pineal gland is a gland that connects the mind, the brain, with the body. Of course, he had not dissected the body. He is speculating here, but he is saying that the connection between the soul and the body is through this gland. And what Avicenna had said earlier, that the soul impacts the body, the soul makes the body, may make the body sick. Descartes builds on that and says it is through this gland, the pineal gland, and that is how the soul gets connected. पिनियल ग्लैंड की वजह से हमारी सोल या रूह जो है वो हमारी बॉडी पे असरअंदाज होती है. तो द ड्यूलिस्ट René Descartes, when he talks about two separate entities, the soul and the body, he also talks about the connection between the soul and the body. तीसरी अहम बात जो डिकार्टे से मुतल्लिक हमें देखनी है वो है that he distinguished between two kinds of thoughts. What are those two kinds of thoughts? Not the kind that Al-Ghazali had said, but in a different vein, in a different way. And what are those two kinds of thoughts? Thoughts which are innate, जो पैदाइशी तौर पर हमारे ज़हन में मौजूद हैं, that we are born with. And the other kinds of thoughts, the acquired thoughts, वो ख्यालात या वो सोच जो हम इर्द गिर्द के हालात को देख के या अपने मुशाहिदात की वजह से एक्वायर कर लेते हैं, वो दूसरी सोच. इनेट एंड एक्वायर्ड, क्या ऐसा ही है? बताइए आपके ख्याल में कोई इनेट थॉट्स हैं, इनबॉर्न? ये सिर्फ डेकार्टे का ख्याल नहीं है, ये और लेटर साइकोलॉजिस्ट भी कहते हैं, गो के इस अंदाज में वो नहीं कह रहे. आपको याद है पिछली दफे हमने जिक्र किया था that there are motives, those which are innate, inborn, and those which are acquired or learned. The driving forces within us, those driving forces that we are born with, hunger, fear, sex, thirst, need for rest, all of these we are born with. And those that we acquire, the will to power, the will to achieve, these are all acquired motives. When Descartes talks about innate thoughts, and when modern psychologists talks about innate motives, they are talking probably about the same thing. That there are certain things which human beings are born with and certain things that human beings acquired. That we, at the time of the birth, have these, and these we acquire during our life experiences. तो ये तीसरी अहम चीज़ है डिकार्टे की contribution, that he distinguished between two types of thoughts. And what are those thoughts? Innate and those that we acquire. Now, what is important to realize in this context is that Descartes was the first European who put forward this mechanical view of the body. First European. इससे क्या इसके नतीजे हुए हम कहाँ तक इसको लेके गए सोच को, ये हम आगे देखेंगे, इसका आगे जिक्र करेंगे। फिलहाल अभी इतना काफ़ी है कि डिकार्ट ने हमें जो बताया है उसमें अहम तरीन चीज़ें कौन कौन सी हैं। चलिए आज के लेक्चर को रैप अप करने के लिए एक दफ़े फिर रीकैप करते हैं, देखते हैं कि हमने क्या क्या देखा है आज तक, डिकार्ट क्या हमें बता रहे हैं। पहली बात तो ये कि हम अब रीबर्थ, यूरोपियन रीबर्थ और रेनेसांस में हैं। दैट इज द 13th to about the end of 15th, beginning of 16th century. This is the time period when we were, by we I mean scientists and philosophers and psychologists, were encouraged to do research, were encouraged to come up with new ideas. Remember, Europe had been in the Dark Ages. What are the Dark Ages? When all new ideas were forbidden, when the old theories were invoked to understand new phenomenon. Abhi problem ye hai that as time goes forward, new things emerge. Computer, gaadiyan, hawai jahaz, the science of rocketry, nuclear science, quantum physics, science of computers, artificial intelligence, all of these things are now emerging. We need new pieces of information, new ways of looking. So if we are trying to invoke old ideas, we won't be able to understand these things. And that is why those time periods were known as Dark Ages, because old ideas were invoked to understand new things, which is not possible. Whereas Renaissance is known as Renaissance because here new ideas were encouraged. People wanted to know how to look at things. So that's one thing that we need to look at, that now we are into the new age. Descartes had postulated an important thing, that is, do not avoid skepticism, do not be afraid of doubt. Follow the doubt and skepticism and it will take you to its logical conclusion. And its logical conclusion is not going to be a negative one. It might be a positive one. In his case, he followed his doubt. He continued to remain skeptical. He continued to doubt. And where did he get? Unlike Ghazali, he got to solid ground, and that solid ground was that cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, and this existence of mine is beyond any shadow of doubt. So, skepticism is not necessarily a bad idea. It might be a good idea, provided you truthfully follow it to its logical end. एक अहम चीज़ हमने ये देखी डेकार्टे के कहने में, डेकार्टे की कंट्रीब्यूशन में, और दूसरी अहम चीज़ जो उन्होंने कही वो ये थी that soul and body are two different entities. That soul exists independently of the body, that soul has its own operative laws and the body has its own operative laws, that the operative laws of the body are like a machine, that we can understand those operative laws. If we can understand those operative laws, we can predict, we can control the body. And soul has its own operative laws. And that the soul, which is one entity, and the body, which is the other entity, are not independent of each other, they are connected. Remember, he had said that the soul and the body are connected to each other by a gland that he called the pineal gland. The soul is superior, the body is inferior, but the soul influences the body. And that is another contribution of Descartes. So what are we talking about? In recap, we talked about how ideas, new ideas were welcomed, how Descartes gave us the idea of doubt, and how Descartes gave us the idea of the soul and the body, and how doubt can provide a firm basis for being on solid ground, and how body and soul may be connected with each other, and how these two may influence each other. रेने डिकार्टे की इस दौर में एक बहुत बड़ी शख्सियत है और इनकी ये बहुत बड़ी कंट्रीब्यूशन है, ख़ास तौर पे डुअलिज्म और ख़ास तौर पर जिसका मैंने जिक्र किया स्केप्टिसिज्म. डुअलिज्म और स्केप्टिसिज्म नफ्सियात की तारीख़ में आपको बार बार दिखाई देंगी. जब हम आगे बढ़ेंगे तो हम बार बार इन चीज़ों पे देखेंगे, बार बार इन चीज़ों पे हमारी नज़र जाएगी कि डुअलिज्म और स्केप्टिसिज्म हमें कहाँ तक पहुँचा रही है. आज के लिए इतना ही काफ़ी है. अगले लेक्चर में कुछ और देखेंगे. जब तक के लिए खुदा हाफिज़.